let's just get into this. The Vokyl Erupt is not worth the $400 price tag. It sits well below that. The build is good, but everything else about the headphone is either hype that does not deliver or is outright the worst experience you will have with an audio product costing as much as the Erupt. The stock earpads are total garbage. There's no mincing words. Vokyl should be ashamed of what they did. And people would be justified in demanding their money back. In fact, if people do demand their money back, I think they would have a legal right to do so. What Vokyl delivered versus what was promised is outlandishly far apart. I previously tried out the Dekoni fenestrated DT earpads. They are a significant improvement over the stock pads. However, people wondered if the ZMF Ori perforated earpads were any better. This is partly because the ZMF pads are a little thicker, therefore potentially more comfortable, and cost a little bit less than the Dekoni. So, I bought the ZMF earpads to test on the Erupt against the Dekoni. I'm not going to make this a long video. I'm going to get right to the point. I tested the Ori pads against the stock earpads and the Dekoni earpads. I plugged the headphones into the Monolith THX Portable and played music off of Amazon Music HD. I used my standard test playlist and various other songs. There is no doubt that the Ori pads are a huge step above the stock earpads. In fact, cardboard sheets on top of wet sponges would sound no worse than the stock pads. The bar, therefore, seems pretty low. The Ori pads provide more bass emphasis than the stock perforated earpads, yet still are not bloated like the stock solid earpads. It's kind of funny how Vokyl was able to royally screw that up. Despite the bass emphasis the Ori pads provide, vocals still sound clear and natural, far more than they do on the stock earpads. Separation of multiple vocalists is slightly better and overall tonality slightly cleaner and clearer on the Ori than on the stock earpads. Treble sounded a little blunted on the Ori pads, just about the same type of sound as on the stock perforated earpads. This may be good for those who are treble sensitive. Horns and brass sound a little off timbre because they lose some of their characteristic high pitch. In exchange, you get a little more forgiving sound signature. Moreover, sibilance is also rolled off, not significantly, but slightly. It's a gradual reduction of sibilance in female vocalists. This is a quite different approach from the stock earpads, both of which cut sibilance down much more. Of the two, the Ori pad sounds more natural in this respect. The Ori pads provide about the same amount of soundstage as the stock earpads, that is, about average. This puts the Ori pads combo on the same playing field as the LCD-1, Sennheiser HD650, and 660S. The Ori pads combination provides slightly less soundstage than the stock configuration of the hi-fi Man Sundara. Detail retrieval was no different from the stock earpads. In New Light by Kazuki, I counted the number of footsteps I could hear within the first 60 seconds of the song. I counted 6 footsteps, which is the same number as on the perforated stock earpads. The Ori pads are thicker, therefore provide extra clamping force the original earpads were missing. The clamping is slightly tighter on the Ori than on the Dekoni earpads. It's not painful, just noticeable. The Ori earpads also provide better seal around the ears than the stock earpads do. As for overall comfort, well, that's an individual assessment. I did not find any of these earpads, the stock, Dekoni, or ZMF, to be uncomfortable. But I will emphasize that the thicker earpads such as the ZMF and Dekoni do make my ears hotter faster than the stock earpads do. In short, the Ori earpads are a night and day difference. The Ori earpads are a combination of the best the stock earpads can offer, which isn't much, and enhances the sound quality. The Ori pads have the bass of the stock solid earpads, except the Ori has much more control over it. The Ori pads have the vocal presence of the stock perforated earpads, except they are presenting more natural tonality and are slightly clearer to boot. Treble reproduction is about the same across the stock and ZMF earpads. There is also a noticeable difference between the ZMF Ori earpads and the Dekoni earpads. The Dekoni have slightly less bass emphasis. The bass decay on the Dekoni is a little bit faster, and the separation of sub-bass and mid-bass is a little bit better. In fact, the Dekoni earpads sound bass light in comparison to the Ori. This, of course, is all comparative. Going back and forth, you could either say that the Ori earpads emphasize the bass, or that the Dekoni rolls off the bass. The fact is, these earpads have different bass tonalities. Mids are slightly clearer on the Dekoni earpads. Part of the reason is because the bass is not as emphasized as on the Ori. Guitars, piano, and drums do not bump into vocals on the Dekoni, whereas they tend to do that on the Ori. Sibilance in vocalists is just a tiny bit more elevated on the Dekoni. Separation of multiple vocalists is marginally better on the Dekoni as well. Again, the more controlled bass on the Dekoni is to thank for this type of sound signature. Treble is more natural on the Dekoni than on the Ori. Horns and brass have a little bit more energy on the Dekoni Earpads, and their natural timbre comes across. Separation of multiple instruments in an orchestral piece is also marginally better on the Dekoni. Whereas the Ori makes everything sound in your face, thicker with less refinement, the Dekoni tends to parse out the group sets and allow you to hear more nuance. Soundstage is slightly wider on the Dekoni Earpads. This combination is close to the soundstage of the Hi-Fi Mansandara. Detail retrieval is also noticeably better on the Dekoni Earpads. On New Light by Kazuki, I heard 10 footsteps with the Dekoni versus the 6 I heard with the Ori Earpads. Surprise, surprise, the stock Earpads continue to be trash. I have tried the following earpad combinations: the stock solid, the stock perforated, Dekoni fenestrated, Dekoni velour, Dekoni hybrid, and ZMF Ori perforated. The only earpads that actually improve the sound are the Dekoni and ZMF perforated earpads. Between the fenestrated Dekoni and ZMF Ori, which should you buy? Well, that depends on what you want to hear. If you want more bass emphasis, more bass and mids melding, and less treble energy, then the Ori earpads are going to sound good to you. If you want better instrument and vocal separation, more natural and neutral bass, and slightly more treble accuracy, then the Dekoni would likely be the better option. The thing is this: no matter what you do, you will never, ever get the sound signature Vokyl and its reviewer collaborators promised. It is simply impossible. All you can hope to do is to improve the comfort while getting closer to the sound signature you were told you'd hear out of the box. To that end, which of the two earpads, the Dekoni and ZMF, come closer to the sound signature that we were all promised? The Dekoni, frankly, hands down. That is because the Dekoni provides wider soundstage, better separation, and more natural bass and treble. Which one sounds more fun for music and movies? Well, if you're the type that likes more bass emphasis in what you listen to, then the ZMF earpads will suit just what you need. I think the Dekoni and ZMF earpads do what the stock earpads should have done. Funny how the ZMF perforated earpads provide better bass than the stock solid earpads. And funny how the Dekoni perforated earpads provide more clarity than the stock perforated earpads. In short, if you end up buying both earpads, you'll get different sound signatures.